So hello all, I'm Robin. I am disabled, I'm queer, and I'm trans. My pronouns are they, them, and he, him. And I am the Assistive Technology Coordinator at the Access Center here at WSU Pullman. And what that means primarily is that when Access Center students need specific technology, some popular options are note-taking software and text-to-speech software, or adaptive furniture such as like chairs that work better for their body than like the little ones that are built into the lecture halls. And then they get referred to me and I talk to them about what they need and give them access to it. This semester I've also spent a lot of time remediating documents to make them accessible for our students who use speech to text. And that wasn't something that was supposed to be such a large part of what I did here, but I'm very happy that it is. It's been a good learning experience. And before we get started, I'm going to practice what I'm going to preach and share that ask for a little bit of grace. I'm dealing with a lot of personal situations this week. Right now, my cat is in the ICU over at the WSU Vet Animal Hospital. So this is not going to be my best work. I'm doing the best that I can with what I have, but please work with me and give me a little bit of grace. What was that? Sorry? Yes, I did get married. I got married last weekend. So my disability journey, my only official diagnosis is anxiety, but I also have symptoms of various other things, including autism and OCD. And I've talked to a couple of therapists. It isn't just self-diagnosis, although I do believe that self-diagnosis is usually valid. But I've talked to therapists and experts who agree that I have some of the symptoms, even though I don't have the official diagnoses. And one of the reasons I don't have those official diagnoses is because it can be complicated to be diagnosed when you're an adult, especially with something like autism, and especially if you are not someone who is a cis white man. So it would be very hard to get a diagnosis. It would be very expensive to get a diagnosis. And because I'm trans, it could possibly impact me negatively in the future, because frequently diagnoses like autism and anxiety are used to deny trans people access to medical transition. And then I also have some slight physical disabilities. I have mild carpal tunnel in my wrist that developed when I was an undergrad and writing a lot of papers and also taking piano classes. And then I've got something a little funky going on with some of my hip nerves that I'll talk about later. Okay, so let's get started. So first off, let's talk about what disability looks like in academia. Well, first we have to talk about academia and disability separately. So what is it that makes somebody disabled? Think about people you know who identify as disabled, or if you are disabled, think about your own experience with disability, identifying as disabled, being diagnosed if you have a diagnosis, and think about how you are supposed to be able to tell if someone is disabled and how you are supposed to know if you are disabled. It looks a little bit different for everybody. So some common threads that a lot of people have are medical diagnoses and support needs. A lot of common experiences include being othered by those who are around you who are not disabled. And then I think I also have up there the ADA definition that you can look at, which is a fairly good definition as it is, but it is several decades old and it's not all inclusive. So don't get too attached to it. We're going to talk about some more definitions in just a minute. Okay, so let's talk about models of disability. Some of these you may be a little bit familiar with. We talk about the medical model and the social model a lot, but I wanted to research some others and share what I learned. So some of the older traditional models are the moral model, which says that disability results from a sin or a moral failing by the individual or by one of their loved ones. There's an example of this actually in the Christian New Testament. Jesus, in I think the book of John, encounters a man who is blind, and his disciples ask him, so who sinned? Was it this man? Was it his parents? Why is he blind? Somebody must have done something wrong. And he says, well, no, they didn't do anything wrong. And he goes on to talk and like show his powers and do a miracle. We're not really going to talk about that right now, but it was a really cool example that like as far back as biblical times, people were using the moral model to establish why somebody could have been disabled. Another traditional definition or a traditional model is the medical model, which says that disability is a medical problem that needs to be cured. So an example I found of this recently is a TV show that is available on Canopy, which is free. I don't know if the TV show is available through WSU Library, but it is available on Canopy. And I had watched a few episodes of it growing up, and I encountered it, and I was like, oh, this might be fun. Let's see what they got wrong. It was pretty bad. So the main character in the show is deaf, and they show some flashbacks of her growing up and how she got to be deaf. And then they show her mom being like, you cannot let people know that you are deaf. You have to present yourself as a hearing person as much as possible. And so they train her to read lips, and they train her to not use sign language, and they train her to speak orally. And it was brutal watching this because like it's presented as the mom doing the loving thing, even though it's kind of strict. And watching it now, like 20 some years later, it's like, ooh, this was not aged well. And it probably wasn't good even for its time. Like this is not a good way to handle a child getting a disability. A good way to handle it would have been her learning sign language, having sign language interpreters with her in school, maybe even going to a school for the deaf rather than pushing her through a standard public school. So that's one way that the medical model can manifest. And then some more recent models include the social model, which says disability is a social construction. It comes from barriers and inaccessible environments. So under this model, someone is disabled because the world isn't built to accommodate them. And disability can theoretically be eliminated if we just design things to be as accessible as possible. I don't believe that we can fully eliminate disability through universal design. I do think universal design is amazing and we should implement it as much as possible wherever we can. But I also believe that there are some disabilities that cannot be UDL'd away, if you will. And then we have the minority group model, which says people with disabilities are oppressed and discriminated against systemically. So the minority group model says all disabled people as a whole face oppression, similar to the way that, say, queer and trans and other minority people and marginalized people face, as a whole, face oppression. The world is built for abled people, and at best, disabled people are an afterthought. We build elevators, but we also like primarily build stairs, or like we build ramps, but they're around the back. And at worst, the systems are designed to eliminate us from public life. So think about how common it used to be, and still is, to institutionalize visibly disabled people. There used to be laws called ugly laws, where if you were too visibly disabled, you just were not allowed out in public. And this is, like, we like to think it's very far in the past, but it was as recently as the 20th century, and some of them are probably still on the books. And then let's talk a little bit about the critical models. So critical disability theory says that disability is fluid, complex, and contextual. So an example from my own life of a disability I have that is fairly fluid and contextual. One of my legs has some nerves that are a little bit funky. In August 2020, I had just graduated with my master's, so I took a job cleaning apartments in between residents because it was August 2020, and there was not a lot available even if you had a master's degree. It was a short-term job. It was only about 2 weeks, but it was hard work. It was very physical manual labor, and it was 8 hours a day for 14 solid days, possibly 15. And after the fact, I don't know exactly what happened, but one of my thighs goes a little bit numb if I stand upright for too long. And when I first got it, it would go a little bit tingly, and I was afraid that I'd have to try and figure out how to see a doctor about it. I still haven't. I probably should, but it's something I have. It's not diagnosed. I don't know what it is. And it's mostly contextual. It's mostly if I stand in one place for too long, which is why you'll see me shifting a little bit up here. But yeah, if I'm walking or sitting, I'm no different than most able-bodied people. It's contextual, it's fluid, it doesn't happen all the time. And then disability justice says that ableism is tied up with other systems of oppression. So this is mostly talking a little bit about intersectionality, which we're going to dive into a little bit later. But think to yourself about how disability can exacerbate or be exacerbated by other marginalizing factors. So for example, disabled people who are born into poverty are not going to be able to access all of the healthcare that they need. And if they can't access the healthcare that they need, then they're less likely to get the supports that they need. They may be undiagnosed and not able to access medication. They may be diagnosed but not able to afford the wheelchair or the crutches or the mobility scooter that they need. And so it gets worse, and it can be a vicious cycle where they can't get the accommodations that they need, and then they can't find a good job where they would be able to use the accommodations, the few accommodations that they have. They aren't able to finish school, so they continue to be in poverty, and they continue to not be able to access what they need. Okay, let's move on a little bit and talk about disability in academia. There was a really good article I found. I cited it at the end. But whether or not academics or students choose to disclose their disabilities and illnesses is in practice a risk-benefit analysis of consequences associated with a specific concern or issue. In order to access support, workplace adjustments, potential financial benefits and allowances, academics and students do need to disclose their conditions. However, disclosing could potentially mean being categorized as a non-deviant within the normed and normalized society, which in turn leads to being stigmatized. So if you are disabled and in this room, then you know what I'm talking about. It's already really hard to come out to yourself as disabled and to come out to others as disabled. And when there's a risk that you're going to lose your position as a student or as a TA, or you're going to be passed over for tenure, it's really, really difficult to justify and to weigh the balance of, do I need the accommodations more? Because if I need the accommodations and I tell them, they might not give me what I need. Or do I just push through and possibly make my health worse and then just burn out? So disabled people, especially visibly disabled people, are often outright denied opportunities, as I talked about. And then invisibly disabled people are sometimes outright denied accommodations. And this can happen to both visibly and invisibly disabled people. And yes, it is illegal, we all know that. But also, how many disabled students specifically, if you're a freshman, you're coming into class and your teacher says, no, I'm not going to give you the accommodation that the testing agreement has, or no, I'm not going to give you the accommodation that's in the letter from the Access Center. How many of them know who they can go to? How many of them have access to a lawyer, and how many of them have experienced in the past telling someone higher up, hey, I'm being denied an accommodation, only to be told, well, no, you didn't really need that anyway. You're going to be fine. And then how many of them have been made to be the villain in that kind of situation? So, something else that happens, hang on. No? Okay. This is all on this one slide. Okay. So something else, they may face assumptions of abilities, positive or negative. People who are visibly disabled or open about their disability face a lot of assumptions. People see someone in a wheelchair, and a lot of them will assume that person cannot use their legs at all. And then if they see someone in a wheelchair use their legs, then they go, oh, they were faking. They don't actually need that wheelchair, which are both often erroneous assumptions. There are people who you can walk for short distances who need a wheelchair. There are people who can stand for short times who use a wheelchair. And there are people who are paralyzed who use a wheelchair. You cannot know just by looking at someone and seeing what accommodations they have visibly what their abilities are. They see someone who, I already said that. They hear that someone has ADHD or autism, and they will assume a certain level of cognitive ability. They hear that somebody has a learning disability, and they assume, oh, they're not going to be able to do super well. They hear that somebody is blind, and they go, okay, well, what use are you going to have for a math class if you can't see the numbers? They don't know a whole lot about the experiences outside of their own life, and they don't always know, sometimes they don't even know what assumptions they're making. It's just so ingrained, it's in the water that they swim in, that they've never thought to question it. And then something else, students in academia, or students who are disabled face a lot of pressure to appear abled, because the culture of academia on just about every level involves bragging about how overworked you are. You hear freshmen talking about how little they sleep. You hear graduate students talking about how much coffee they had that morning. You hear people talking about how many hours they put into their research or how many hours they put into grading. And there's a lot of pressure for disabled students to meet that kind of, to also brag about that, to talk about how hard they're working and to not appear different, because accommodations are frequently seen as a way for them to be lazy. There's a lot of assumption of, oh, well, you just are able to get notes for your tests because you don't want to study. Or what are the other examples I have here? You get flexible deadlines because you just want to procrastinate. You don't really need them. You attend virtually because you can't be bothered to get out of bed. Students face a lot of assumptions of their abilities, even when they are already really pushing themselves to meet. Sometimes the bare minimum, sometimes they're doing really well, and sometimes other areas of their lives are failing because of that. It is often at the risk of their physical and mental, and sometimes emotional health, that they push themselves to appear as able as possible. Okay, let's talk a little bit about how disabilities impact students. So here's something to know, is that everybody's a snowflake. You can have two people who have the same diagnosis, and they have vastly different experiences with that. So here, autism, one of my own disabilities. So version A, you've got a student who experiences sensory overload frequently, and they wear silencing headphones and sunglasses in public to help with that sensory overload. And they stem by maybe tapping their fingers like this, or something like that. And then you've got another student with autism who needs a lot of sensory input, likes to play with things that are tactile, likes to make a lot of noise, can't always tell if their voice is at a comfortable volume for others, and they stim by vocalizing or with echolalia, which is repeating a sound. And these two students have the same diagnosis. They're both autistic. They have very different access needs, and they present very differently. So you cannot always assume that you know how a student is, or what a student is going to need, or how they're going to behave based on what you get in their access center agreement, on the letter from the access center and their ATA. And then we've got the intersection of disability with other identities. So we talked about this very briefly earlier on, but Black people, Indigenous people, people of color are a lot more likely to be disabled than white people. People of lower socioeconomics class are more likely to be disabled. People with marginalized gender identities, which includes cis women, trans men, non-binary people, people with other cultural identities, are more likely to be disabled than cis men. And disabled people are more likely to face sexual violence than non-disabled people. So there's a lot of barriers already if you're coming into the world as someone who is BIPOC or as someone who is lower socioeconomic class. And then on top of that, you're more likely to be disabled or to become disabled. And then, as we talked about earlier, if you're BIPOC or if you're of a lower socioeconomic class, you're less likely to be able to access the health care you need to help with that disability. And then, of course, you're more likely to develop disabilities, like if you face more violence and more sexual violence, you're more likely to develop other disabilities on top of what you already have, such as PTSD. So let's talk a little bit about clashing access needs. So going back to a few slides ago, we've got two kids with autism. One of them experiences sensory overload where silencing headphones and sunglasses stems by tapping their fingers, is generally pretty quiet and withdrawn. And then you've got another kid with autism who needs a lot of sensory input, likes doing things tactilely, can't always tell if their voice is at a comfortable volume, will yell sometimes, stems by vocalizing with echolalia. These two kids, if they're in the same class, there's going to be some conflicting access needs. The one kid probably won't want to engage as much with other students, will probably sit in the back, wear their headphones, be listening, be somewhat engaged, might not be talking to the people around them. And the other one might be a little bit more front forward, has probably been labeled a problem child in their past, might have taken on an identity of life of the party or the joker. So you're going to have several different access needs that need to be handled at the same time. You're going to have to figure out how to juggle that. There is no one right way to handle it. There are a lot of wrong ways, but there is no necessarily one right way to handle that. So something that I would recommend doing is communicating with each student individually and just tell them, hey, your access needs may conflict with another student's access needs, particularly your need to be in a silent environment, your need to talk, your inability to tell if your voice is at a good volume. It may conflict with other access needs. How do you want me to handle that? And talk to them about what they need and what they need from you, and then talk to the other student and say, okay, so here's what's happening. We don't necessarily have to out them to each other. I would recommend not doing that unless they express interest mutually. But talk to them individually and see what works. And there is not going to be one right answer for every situation. What works in one class with the same two students may not work in the other class with the same two students. And then let's talk a little bit about what it looks like to center disabled students. So first off, ask your students what they need from you. Let your students be anonymous or private when you do this. Don't ask people to raise their hands in class to say, yes, I need text-to-speech and I need large print. Freshmen are not going to do that. That is a good way to tell people that your class is not a safe environment and that they will be outed if they ask for accommodations, and they may be afraid to approach you about that. Let them be anonymous, let them write something on a note card, let them email you privately. Talk to them one-on-one if you feel that you need to, or if they're not comfortable meeting one-on-one physically, again, email them or Teams them, something like that. Let them come to you on their own terms. Be open about your own access needs. This is something that was very helpful when I was an instructor in the math department. I was open about how I'd used the Access Center as a graduate student and how it had helped me to be able to take tests in a private room with extra time, and encouraged a lot of students to approach me and say, okay, I'm not with the Access Center, but I do have these access needs. And I was able to work with them to say, okay, so you would prefer a private room, you're not with the Access Center, so what we can do is we can give you a test at a separate time, and we can like reserve a room in the Cub, I think is what I usually did. And I would give them as much time as they needed to complete the exam. And not everybody is going to be able to do this. I was able to do this because I only ever had 1 or 2 classes. If you've got 300 students, 5 or 6 classes, this is going to be more difficult. But this is what I was able to do for my student. Where was I? Be open about your own access needs, and then let them know that they're not alone. I had a professor when I was in math, one of my first semesters there, Judy McDonald, shared a story about a student who had unusual access needs. He had a lot of trouble verbalizing by writing, and so when he took his exams, what he would do is he would do verbal exams with her one-on-one. And so she shared that as an example of an accommodation that she was able to give. And I didn't need that accommodation, but it was nice to know that I was taking a class with someone who cared about her students and who was willing to work with them if they needed particular access needs. And then also you can direct students to the Access Center. I did that a lot when I was an instructor. Not everybody was able to go to the Access Center. Not everybody had like the documentation to provide to the Access Center. Not everybody had an official diagnosis. Not everybody was comfortable going to the Access Center for help. But even if they don't, you can also approach and say, I have students with these access needs. How can I help them best? And then we can direct you to resources or talk to you about what to do. So next, be flexible and willing to learn. Your students are the experts on their disabilities and their needs, and not all disabled people have documentation, and not all disabled people, as we know, are visibly disabled. So your students' needs may change over the course of a semester. They may realize halfway through that they need more support, or that they need less support, or that they need different supports than they thought they did at the beginning of the semester. You don't always know how a course is going to go until you're in the thick of it, and you realize, oh, I really need that extra time on the exam. I really need note cards when I'm doing a presentation. Students may need supports that you aren't familiar with. So again, be flexible and willing to learn. You may have students asking for things that you've never had to do before. You may have students asking for supports that you haven't heard of before. And that doesn't mean that they aren't supports that they need. It means that you just haven't encountered it before. So you can take a step back if you need to and say, okay, let's talk about how to get you this. And then again, you can talk to the Access Center. We're always willing to listen and help if we can. One of the things that I want all of y'all to take away from me is that UDL is great. We should continue moving toward that goal. And at the same time, we cannot UDL our way out of disability entirely. You're going to always have students who have particular access needs that you are not going to be able to fulfill. And that's okay. That's why the Access Center is here. We're here to help you with those access needs that you cannot do on your own, and that cannot be systematized out of existence, as good as that would be. So be willing to let your classroom look different. Look around at the unnecessary barriers that are in your classroom for disabled students and see what you can eliminate. Can you replace the exams with other assignments like projects or papers? Can you let students choose whether to take an exam or to do a project or to do a paper? Can you allow flexible deadlines? Can you eliminate busy work assignments? Can you stop using ALEX, for instance? That was something a lot of students had trouble with when I was teaching math, because it would just continually give them more and more assignments until a lot of students just felt overwhelmed and gave up on it entirely. And that was a fair bit of their grade that they were giving up on because it just wouldn't let them proceed. This is going to be a bit controversial, but encourage masking and wear a mask yourself. We have students who are chronically ill. We have students who are immunocompromised. I myself am fairly high risk for COVID, and it is terrifying to be out in public and not see people wearing a mask, because you know that any one of them could have an infectious disease that you're going to catch. And you might not, but someone else in the class might. And it's really good praxis just to wear a mask. A lot of disability activists, if you follow any of them on Twitter, talk about how important it is to continue masking. COVID is not over as much as we wish it was. We are not post-COVID yet. I feel like I had more here. Okay, so also question academia standards. So think about institutional changes that you can make. So you've made your classroom as friendly as possible for disabled students, which is great. A lot of disabled students aren't going to be able to come to your classroom because they can't get into the college. So you are not going to be able to fix everything yourself, but you can do a lot to change things. You can talk to your administrators and say, hey, I think we can eliminate this exam to allow people to become graduate students. I think we can allow people to choose something other than taking the exam to become a graduate student. I think we can allow for like different formats of this, that, or the other. I think we should be able to like, I can't think of any other examples off the top of my head, but talk to people around you and see what kind of institutional changes could we make. Talk to the disabled students who are in like your grad programs or who are in college about what barriers they faced when they were joining your classroom before they became a student at WSU, and see like, okay, what can we eliminate there? How could we make the process easier? Okay, and then let's talk a little bit about the benefits of UDL for disabled students, which we've already kind of talked about, but just a quick summary. UDL helps students avoid being outed as disabled. So declaring a disability, chronic illness, or neurodiversity is not only a matter of succumbing to social oppression and control. Ticking the I am disabled box is a statement and commitment. By underwriting a disability, the academic has to be confident and comfortable with identifying as a disabled person. And a lot of students may not be comfortable with that yet. I know it took me several years. I don't think I was comfortable identifying as disabled until several years after I had like been diagnosed as anxious, as having generalized anxiety. And I had already like started suspecting that I was autistic and that I had OCD. And only a little bit later was I like, maybe I'm disabled. Maybe that's a label that works for me. Everybody's journey looks different. And some students are not going to be willing to label themselves as disabled yet. So this is a good way to help them as they're like working on getting themselves ready to do that. At the same time, you cannot always hide a disability. There are always going to be people who have visible disabilities, but it helps them appear more like their peers. It means that they don't have to like be open about all of their access needs. A lot of disabled people are told that they should hide their disability as much as possible, and this is a good way of making sure that like they can work on that internally on their own time, and you can make sure they get the access needs that they deserve. And additionally, like I said, disability is an opt-in identity. You don't usually go to the doctor, get a diagnosis, and come out and say, well, okay, I'm disabled now. It does happen that way for some people, but for a lot of people, it's a journey to identify that way. It's a journey to come to accept, okay, I'm disabled, that's a label that applies to me, what now? Additionally, it removes the burden of proof from the student. So as we talked about, not all disabled people have an official diagnosis. Not all of them have paperwork, even if they have in the past received an official diagnosis. So in utilizing UDL as much as possible is a way of ensuring that your students are able to like get the accommodations they need without having to jump through the hoops of like showing people their paperwork and saying, okay, here, I'm disabled, I have this, these are my access needs. And additionally, at the Access Center, what we require is not just a diagnosis, but sort of a justification from the doctor saying, okay, so this is their diagnosis, and these are the reasons why they need these specific accommodations. And like, the Access Center is great. I would prefer if we didn't have to have justifications for students' access needs. I would prefer if students were able to just say, this is what I need. And we were able to say, yes, here you go, here it is. That's not the way it is right now. That's the way I wish it could be. And that's something that UDL can help with in the short term. And a lot of disabled people choose to go without accommodations rather than face those hurdles, or are forced to, as I said, because they cannot face those hurdles. They do not have the documentation. They do not have the paperwork. They are unable to afford a diagnosis. And then it levels the playing field. It lets disabled students know that they are welcome in your classroom, which is a huge deal. It may not seem like much. I know most professors want to think that they are welcoming, and I know that we all try to be as welcoming as possible, but letting disabled students specifically know that they are welcome to be disabled in your classroom, that they don't have to mask if they're neurodivergent. They don't have to pretend that they can walk when they would rather use a cane. They don't have to pretend that they're able to do something when they can't do it. That is huge for a lot of students. It also enables students to be more open about their needs. so they know that they can come to you, again, similar to knowing that they're welcome in your classroom, and say, okay, so this is something I have. I know this isn't a usual accommodation, but can you help me? And you may be able to find a way for them to get that accommodation that they need. It also allows students to more fully and comfortably participate in the classroom. If you don't have to focus on masking your face and having, like for me, as I'm autistic, if I don't have to focus on having the correct expression on my face all the time, I'm a lot more able to think about the content and to be able to contribute to the discussion. If someone doesn't have to focus on presenting themselves as abled, then they're more able to engage in what's happening around them, and it's more enjoyable for pretty much everyone. It's a lot easier to concentrate when you aren't concentrating, or a lot easier to participate when you aren't concentrating on pretending to be abled. And then here are some of the resources that I used. And if anybody would like a list of them, a lot of them are really good, especially the Ableism in Academia article. Please feel free to reach out if you'd like to contact me to get a copy. Thank you.